So the disparagement of childhood innocence is one of the things which seems to blow the rooftop for people who are suspicious about Freud. And Larkin's famous lines, "They fucked me up, me mom and dad," is that the correct? Yeah. I've always loved them, but I have some doubts because in terms of my own life, I think I played it's one of the few revelations of analysis, or one of the many, was that I played a part in the whole matter too. But anyway, I'm Francis Levy. I'm co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Dr. Ed Necessian is the other co-director, and welcome to Our Life in Poetry Motion on Larkin. The art you see on the walls is part of an exhibit that's been organized by Hallie Cohen, chair of the art department at Marymount Manhattan College, and it's called Self-Reflection, the True Mirror. And we urge you to go into the what we call our annex. It's the room adjacent here. And look, there's an object called a true mirror in which you see yourself the way other people see you. As I've said before, this is the last time I will say this. I looked in the true mirror, and as all I can say is I wasn't happy with what I saw. In terms of our website, Adam, did you want to say, if you go to events, you go to www.philoctetes.org, you can always see any event that we're doing. Right now, we are simulcasting people everywhere. There's someone in Romania who watches us, actually, who I should say hello to right now. There's one. We see the numbers. So you can go to our site, and if you go to the events section of the site, you can actually log in and respond to be part of a discussion board. Am I correct in that? And also, there was one other thing about the site that you wanted me to remember?
Oh, just the poems.
Oh, yes, the poems.
On the site, you
poems.
can download them and print them.
A lot of people always ask about poems. Right. Emphasizing that when we do poetry, the poetry series, you can download the poems from the site itself. So now, I'm very pleased to introduce Michael Braziller. He's the director of the Philoctetes Poetry Series. He's the president and publisher of Persea Books, which is an extremely fine literary publishing house which specializes in literary fiction and poetry. And Mike Braziller will introduce our distinguished guest tonight. And take it away, Mike.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Andrew Motion is the author of 10 books of poetry, including Dangerous Play, which won the Llewellyn Rees Prize, Natural Causes, which won the Dylan Thomas Award, and most recently, Public Property. He is also the author of 6 books of prose, among them the widely acclaimed biographies John Keats and Philip Larkin, A Writer's Life, which won the Whitbread Biography Award. And he's also written a short novel, The Invention of Dr. Cake, which combines elements of mystery and detective fiction. Andrew has been editor of Poetry Review, as well as poetry editor and editorial director of London publishers Chatto and Windus. He taught English at the University of Hull, where he met Philip Larkin, and he's going to talk a little about that. Currently, he is professor of creative writing at Royal Holloway University of London and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. In May of 1999, Andrew Motion was appointed Britain's Poet Laureate. This evening, we will discuss a few poems by Philip Larkin. In addition, Andrew will read from In the Blood, which are there copies for sale outside. I'm sure Andrew will be happy to sign. It's an exceptional, evocative, and beautiful memoir of growing up in rural England after the war. It is kind of an elegy for lost childhood and for the loss of his mother after a catastrophic riding accident. As I mentioned, Andrew will conclude by reading from this and from some of his own poems. Okay, so we're going to divide the evening in that way, and let's take a look at some of Philip Larkin's poetry. We've selected 6 poems, and we probably will not get to all of them, but maybe Andrew... Oh, before we get into the poems, we were going to talk for a few minutes about meeting Larkin and a little background for people who might not know him that well.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. I just wanted to begin by saying that I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's great for me to be here, and of course particularly nice of Michael to give up his evening to put these questions to me, and I'm very concerned that he and I should have what feels to you like a conversation rather than anything more formal than that in this first session, and then this conversation become a larger one as you fire questions at us, and who knows where we'll go with all that in what will effectively be the second part. As Michael's already indicated, I did know Larkin pretty well for the last 10 years of Larkin's life. More useful perhaps to begin by saying that I first read his poems when I was a schoolboy. In fact, they were among the first poems that I read. My background was not at all a bookish one. My parents were not readers. I think Michael may have heard me say this before. My mother read a little bit. My father read half a book in his life, so he used to claim, which was a thriller called The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes, that he thought wasn't thrilling enough, so he never got to the end of it. And if it were not for the brilliance of an English teacher that I had when I was sort of 16 thereabouts, I wouldn't be sitting here now. I mean, I owe this man my life, in the sense that my life has been in literature pretty much ever since then, and in poems in particular. This guy, whose name is Peter Way, gave us Hardy to read, he gave us Larkin to read, he gave us Edward Thomas to read, he gave us Wordsworth to read. So I had, right from the get-go, as you would say, a sense of Larkin belonging in a certain sort of tradition of voiced English writing, low-key, conscious of its wanting to belong in an unostentatious way in the flow of life, not seeking to set itself up as fancy or any such thing. I also gathered at the same time as I was reading those early poems by Larkin, this would have been about 1965, 6, 7, 8, they're kind of around there, that Larkin had a reputation of being formidably standoffish, unmarried, grumpy, a sort of Eeyore, who'd lived his life in towns that were themselves remote, and then had made himself remote within them. So when I, after school, went to university, did my first degree there, did my second degree there, actually on Edward Thomas, did my research on Edward Thomas, and then went off to teach. At the moment that I finished doing my research and began thinking about jobs, was in the middle of Mrs. Thatcher, then the education minister's rampage through the British universities, chopping them down to what she thought was a sensible size, and in fact ruining them as she did so in most cases, giving them a problem that is still really to be solved in certain senses too. And which meant, to put it briefly, that there weren't very many jobs, but there was a job at the University of Hull, so I thought, well, I'll go for that, because Larkin is there, really. Larkin was born in 1922, went to Hull in 1955, so he'd been there by the time I got there already for 20 years as the librarian in the university, running the enormous university library very efficiently. All his working life he'd worked as a librarian. I thought that there might be a chance to meet him, and of course I thought that. I was 24 or something, and I had a very, very high opinion of his work, and I was by far from being alone in having that high opinion. I suppose you might say really that the British poetry, the two great sort of trees in the forest through the last part of last century, were Larkin and Ted Hughes. Very interestingly unalike too, in ways that we might talk about later. Complementary in some respects, almost adversarial in others. Anyway, I got there, got the job, got there, and then hung around nervously for the first several weeks, wondering how I was going to meet this man. And in fact was introduced to him, first of all, by my professor, who said, would you like to come and meet him? And I said, yes, you know, kind of like that. So we went off and had a drink in the university. This was in the days when people drank at lunchtime. And in Larkin's case, drank a lot at lunchtime, and then even more in the evening. He drank at breakfast. Yeah. He wasn't drinking at breakfast by this time, but I'm afraid towards the end he was. In fact, I can remember him saying to me, after we'd become friends, when I was miserable about something or other, saying, he had a rather beautiful sort of swooping voice, like this, full of melancholy, sort of weighted voice. And I'd been moaning about something or other, and he said, why don't you start drinking port at breakfast? That was his solution to the sort of problems that you talk about in this building. I'm not recommending it. Anyway, he took me to this was beginning already to have rather an alcoholic theme, this bit of the conversation, because at the very first time I met him, something rather extraordinary happened, which was that it was for me like going to meet God, I have to say. I mean, I was a lot younger than him, and I absolutely revered him. He did have this formidable reputation for being not standing for any nonsense and being very rude to people sometimes. But he liked the fact that I'd been to Oxford, which is where he'd been. So I had that sort of advantage. And about 3 sentences into our first conversation, he took a swig of beer from his beer mug, and it went down the wrong way. And the way that, of course, it sometimes does when you're having a drink. And he started spluttering and choking and coughing and took off his glasses. An extraordinary thing, you almost never see people who wear glasses all the time without their glasses, unless you're going to bed with them. Or they're sort of disadvantaged in some way or other. And, of course, he was seriously disadvantaged by having quite a lot of beer going down the wrong way. So far from being sort of at his feet looking upwards at the holy object, I was pounding him on the back. And then when he'd recovered, he said, and we started chatting more generally, he said, "What does your father do?" And I said, "Well, my father, who I think was still working then, or just retired maybe." I said, which is true, he was a brewer. And Philip's eyes lit up because he thought that I think that I came from stock that had produced something that people actually want rather than art, which of course they can take or leave. Anyway, on that basis, we have sort of immediately liked each other, rather surprisingly. I mean, I was going to like him, whatever, but rather surprisingly, he seemed to like me back, as it were. And then the Hull Daily Mail, that great organ of the free world, decided to run a poetry competition almost immediately afterwards. Which was to celebrate the opening of a huge bridge across a big river that the River Humber that Hull sits on the edge of. And they asked Philip to be one of the judges, and he said yes, because I think he felt that he'd lived there so long he couldn't very easily say no. And they asked me to be a judge, because my first book of poems, I think, was just coming out. So they knew I was writing it as well as teaching it. And I hadn't been there long enough to say no, so we were sort of brought together in this way. That was the first time I went to his house. Now, of course, it's a significant moment when you cross anybody's threshold. But to cross Larkin's threshold was like stepping into a sort of parallel universe, really. I mean, it was in the sense that it was very, very closely guarded. People just didn't go and see him at home in that sort of way, apart from his most intimate friends. And we had to do that in order to judge the competition. And that evening, I suppose, cemented our friendship. I can't remember a thing about it, of course. And through what turned out to be the last 9 or nearly 10 years of his life, we saw each other a lot while I was still at Hull, where I worked for 3 years. I mean, daily, really, and spent a lot of time spending the evenings together. I was more or less alone most of that time, so I had a lot of time on my hands, and he was more or less alone too. When I left, I went back to Oxford again, and he used to come down to Oxford a lot, so we saw each other a lot then too. And just before he died, when he had no signs of being in ill health, he wrote and said that he was coming down on such and such a day, and could we have lunch? And I said, yes, of course, and I'll ask so-and-so. And he said, no, I want to see by yourself. And it turned out that he wanted to remake his will so that there was, to make me one of his literary executors. And I said, well, I will do that, but don't die. And 6 months later, he was dead. And his relict, and the sort of senior trustee, as it were, Monica Jones, the only person that he ever dedicated a book of poems to, dedicated his book, The Less Deceived, to her, asked me to write his life. And that's how the book came to be written. And she did that thing that all biographers sort of dream of. Though, of course, it was a melancholy thing for me to undertake because I was missing him still very much and so on. I mean, I loved him, you know, and I missed him. But nevertheless, at a sort of practical level, it was a wonderful thing for her to do. She picked up his address book and threw it at me across the room and said, everybody's in here. And they were. I mean, everybody I needed to talk to was in there. And then she said, now go upstairs and look in the little room under the stairs, at the top of the stairs. So I did, and there was a sort of boat-shaped room. And it was floor to ceiling, full of shoeboxes with initials on them. And they were all the letters that he'd ever received from anybody. I mean, he'd librarianized his entire existence. And of course, I looked at it and I thought, well, that is wonderful. I mean, it is absolute. The book is there somewhere. But if somebody is doing that to themselves, the first question you must ask is what they've left out. I mean, it's sort of forbiddingly complete. There wasn't any sort of terrible dark secret that wasn't somehow or other followable through the material in that room, though there were nevertheless extraordinary discretions in his life and extraordinary separations that he made between the various compartments of his life. I mean, we all compartmentalize our life in certain ways, but he did it to an extraordinary degree. Prose from poems, people from each other. And quite often I found myself sitting down with women who didn't know, who thought they were the only one when they weren't. So there was a lot of rather delicate sort of human work to be done in amongst the what one might call the more sort of predictable literary work in writing. But I mean, I could go on forever about this, so I better stop there. But I mean, I hope it gives that gives you some sense of the.
It's very, very useful, and it can sort of stay out there as we look at the poems. I think it's very pertinent, everything to the individual poems, and
good.
So, let me read the first one. You wanted to do.
Yes.
You wanted to do Coming.
Well, this is quite an early poem of his. I mean, one of the things that I tried to think about when I was choosing which poems to suggest that we might look at was to give you some sense of the range or not of his work. I don't just mean the range of the subjects that he covers and so on, but I also mean something about development. Does he develop? He was very fond of quoting, I think it's Oscar Wilde, isn't it, who said in his mischievous way, "Only mediocrities develop." Well, it's worth thinking about that.
Coming. On longer evenings, light, chill, and yellow bathes the serene foreheads of houses. A thrush sings, laurel surrounded, in the deep, bare garden, its fresh-peeled voice astonishing the brickwork. It will be spring soon, it will be spring soon, and I, whose childhood is a forgotten boredom, feel like a child who comes on a scene of adult reconciling and can understand nothing but the unusual laughter and starts to be happy.
Well, like I say, it's an early poem. It's very characteristic in its sort of dying fall and its cadences. It's also very typical in some respects of his sort of take on life, particularly the view that he took of childhood, describing his own childhood there as a forgotten boredom. Actually, immediately worth sort of saying, I think that seems to me like a kind of contradiction in terms. I mean, what he's remembering very vividly is the boringness of it, but we understand at the surface level of what he means about that. Very uncharacteristic in its being prepared to admit some degree of qualified happiness. I mean, the poems, by and large, don't give themselves much room to describe themselves as happy, but there we have it, as I say, in this highly qualified way. But were there particular things that you wanted to quiz me about, Michael, in relation to...
Well, no, I'm thinking about what you said. I think that it is unique from his other poems, or different from what comes later, in that sense of freedom, or a kind of a mood of release at the end of the poem. And yet, there's a tone of loneliness to it as well.
Yeah.
It always seems to be him. It always seems to be him, very, very alone, observing.
I think that's right. In what few love poems there are, often very beautiful ones, there exactly what you've just said is often borne out. I mean, I'm thinking, as I say this, of a poem like Broadcast, for instance, in which he's actually physically remote, as he often is in such poems, from the person that he's writing about. The situation in that poem, Broadcast, is that he's at home listening to the radio to a concert being played, and the woman that he's in love with is at the concert. And so he's imagining, it's a fantastically good idea, isn't it, for a poem? And he can imagine her sitting there.
Yes, there's this I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's it's a great ambivalence about solitude. On the one hand, there's a genuine, he seems almost uncertain, there's a genuine pleasure in it.
Yeah.
And there's obviously,
that's right.
It's scary
that's right.
if it's taken too far.
Yes, and actually I think that's true. I mean, I know we're here to talk about poems and not about biography, and there is a sort of separation to make about this all the time. But that is true of his biography as well, that he is somebody who deeply kept himself to himself in the ways that I've already described, right. But also had an extraordinary capacity for tenderness and connectedness with people. He just didn't want to see very many of them and have them kind of one at a time, you know. Well, I think a lot of us perhaps feel some version of that. I mean, the other thing I think that is perhaps worth saying in connection with that poem, because it's going to be a little bit of a sort of theme that develops, I think, through the other things that we're going to say, is that that poem comes in his first mature book. He wrote comparatively few poems, Larkin. There are 3 mature books, for want of a better word. First is called The Less Deceived, in which that poem first appeared. That came out in 1955. Then 10 years later, another book came out called The Wits and Weddings, and I think we're going to look at that poem in a little while.
Right.
And then after another 10 years, his third and last book called High Windows, and I think we're going to look at that poem in a little while too. So it's pretty sparse, and these are short books too. They're sort of 40 pages long. But before the first of them, The Less Deceived, came out, he published a book with a small press called The North Ship, which was later reissued by Faber, who became his publishers eventually. And when it was reissued, he wrote an introduction to it, explaining some of the circumstances of its original production. And he talks very interestingly in that introduction about the relationship that he had early on in his writing life, towards the end of university, through the first job that he had after he left university, which was as a sub-librarian in a little town near the Welsh border in England. He talks about the relationship between what is effectively a sort of symbolist loyalty that he has, Yeats in particular, absolutely kind of crazy about Yeats. I mean, he caught Yeats like an infection, and his poems are very, very highly coloured by his reading of Yeats. Interestingly, much more by early Yeats than late Yeats. I mean, it's not the kind of foul rag and bone shop of the heart Yeats that he's interested in. It's the rather misty-eyed, sort of vaguely pre-Raphaelite early Yeats. And he cures himself, to use an image that he actually uses in this introduction, of the Celtic fever, as he calls it, by reading Hardy. I mean, he sort of injects himself with Hardy against Yeats, thereby giving us the idea that what he has done is to trade in one way of writing, one kind of poetic language, which would be this rather elevated, floaty, as I say, misty-eyed language, for something which is much more interested in practicalities, engaged with realities, commonplace, acquainted with the familiar and relishing the familiar, which is, of course, something that we associate with Hardy. As I say, giving us readers the idea that he has traded in one for the other. It's very much my view that at the level of cadence, actual sort of hard language, the evidence of hard language, human expectation, everything, the whole packet, what's happening in a lot of the poems is some sort of negotiation being made between the sort of schools of thought and the schools of writing and the schools of living that are crudely exemplified by whatever the difference between Yeats and Hardy is. It's not very evident in that poem, but you can feel a sort of high art lyric drag on the real familiar language that it uses. I think there's a kind of tug towards what we're characterizing as the Yeatsian mode in this, and it's being resisted by the more empirical note of Hardy.
This is sort of maybe a superficial question, but is is the thrush here at all related? In mood, the darkling thrush,
indeed,
you know, it seems to have...
I think you're right. I think that is, I think it's a real bird in a real place, to paraphrase one of his other lines, or to adapt one of his other lines. But I think that, I think it probably does, it does have a sort of literary inheritance to it. I mean, this prompts me to say something that I've always believed very strongly about Larkin, and I must say about some of the other writers who work in what sometimes gets called the English tradition as well. Certainly true of Edward Thomas, this, which is to say that you quite often find yourself reading a poem which looks incredibly simple. I mean, as though it's just being talked at you in the most delightful way. But which, the more you roll it round your mind, turns out to be a little kind of echo chamber of references to other writers and so on. What William Hazlitt calls a cento, when he's talking about some of his romantic contemporaries. And I think that's a very good example of this happening in Larkin. Yes, these are real things in real places. They are empirically true, but they are also so rich in associations that there is a sense of sort of tapestry, or as I say, echo chamber about it.
Also, when we read further, maybe I'm finding this increasingly with poetry, or good poetry in general, but particularly coming back to Larkin, is a tremendous ambiguity in a way.
Yes.
He seems to say one thing and then backs off it, and then it's the moods he projects are very, very complex.
They are. I mean, the poems,
and very subtle.
Absolutely right. No, that's completely on the button. I mean, the poems proceed almost by indirections, by qualifications, by half saying something and then sort of going off in another direction. And yet, at the same time, they have an odd air of resolution about that lack of resolution. I think they're sort of confident in their lack of confidence, if you like. You don't feel this is a man in a dither, which you do with reading certain poets. You feel it's somebody who feels the only way to deal with experience is to be not quite sure about it, to be sort of helpfully in two minds. Romantically, actually, capital R romantically.
And ambivalence everywhere. When we looked at the Whitsun weddings, you know, what is his feeling about these excited couples together as opposed to his own loneliness? And it seems to shift throughout the poem.
Well,
would you like to read that?
Well, shall I
This
read
is
it?
a real treat to hear Andrew read.
Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to sort of be a bit patient.
Mike, do you want to speak up a little louder?
Speak up louder? Okay, I will do that. I'm sorry. I'm glad you spoke up. Here, you want to read from mine?
I've got it.
Okay, you have it?
Thank you.
It's a long poem. If you need help, I can read part of it, or see how... Okay, go ahead.
You're giving it to me, I'm going to hog it.
Okay, good. This is...
Well, it is a long poem, this...
Would you say this is him at his... I mean, the early poem we just looked at is an early... You know, is it?
It is.
Yeah, but
I mean, it's
this
a
is him at his...
thing, but this is absolutely him in his pomp.
Okay.
What we see here is in doing all the things he does best. It has a very large and developed narrative component to it. It has lots of local beauties. It has all the ambivalences that you've been talking about just there, Michael. It has a fantastic sense of, as you'll see, which I'll try and catch in the way that I read it, of sort of lift-off at the end, a sort of jump jet ending, which is very characteristic of the way his poems move at their best. They assemble themselves in the familiar, everyday world, and then they just rise up and lifted by their rhetoric into some other universe.
Well, even the short poem we just read sort of did that too. Very interesting.
It's a very interesting shape they have in that respect, I think. Anyway, it does go over the page, so sit tight.
Okay.
If you haven't read it before, the situation here is that, though he doesn't quite say it in this detail, but he often used to say it, he's got on the train at Whitsun time, which is characteristically associated with the time that people get married. He's got on the train in Hull, and he's on the train from Hull to London, which takes about 3 hours. Probably more back then when he wrote it. The Whitsun weddings. That Whitsun, I was late getting away. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my 3/4 empty train pull out. All windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock. Thence the river's level, drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle, and canals with floatings of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely, hedges dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first, I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made, each station that we stopped at. Sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade. And down the long, cool platforms, whoops and skirls I took for porters larking with the mails and went on reading. Once we started, though, we passed them, grinning and pomaded, girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely, watching us go, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms, the fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewellery substitutes, the lemons, mauves and olive ochres that marked the girls off unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed aboard. The rest stood round. The last confetti and advice were thrown, and as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last, and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots, and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, "I nearly died," a dozen marriages got underway. They watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl. And none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London, spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed. And as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close. And it was nearly done, this frail, travelling coincidence. And what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain. It is the most fantastic poem, that, I think. Yeah. It gets me every time I read it.
It is really very powerful. Is there almost, as I reading these poems again and again now, is there almost a kind of everywhere in him a wistful or this solid or just a longing for something, or
yes,
a sense,
quite, and simultaneously a distrust of it. I mean, a registering of it, a relish for it, and an appreciation that other people might be able to have it and enjoy it. but simultaneously the sense that it can't be for him.
I mean, the key thing here is that he's alone,
Quite.
writing about people
Absolutely.
who have just become
Yes.
unalone.
Indeed.
And
Indeed.
that contrast.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a brilliant setting up, I mean, a brilliant
Yeah.
situation for his...
It is. It's like a chapter in a novel, isn't it? I mean, it's got all this sort of amplitude that you associate with prose. He did write a couple of novels early on in his life, and it's quite interesting to think, though it's sort of unprovable this, except by saying what a sort of thing that I've just said, that a lot of the, as I say, the amplitude, the expansiveness that one associates with prose fiction, he does manage to get into lyric poems. So you might say that he didn't, as it were, turn his back on novels. He just turns them into poems instead. Right. But yes, that ambiguity that you've put your finger on there is matched, I think, by all sorts of other little things in the poems, and some not so little things in the poems. I mean, quite what is the attitude to these women wearing these clothes? I mean, sometimes people get at Larkin and say he's sort of sneering at them, and that there's a sort of class thing going on here, that these are kind of working class people who are wearing clothes that middle class people laugh at because they think they're sort of gaudy and vulgar. And I think they have a point, the people who say that, but at the same time as that is being registered in the poem, there is something, he's sort of delighting, I think, in their beingness, you know, in them being themselves, and he's envying them something too. I mean, they've got something but he simultaneously doesn't want and regrets not being able to have.
Definitely. I mean, yeah. There is this almost. He's so observant and always borderline sarcastic or parroting, and seems to be almost ridiculing these people, but it's from a position of complete solitude.
Yes, quite.
And
but we don't feel
a tone of not being comfortable.
That's right.
And yet he is comfortable. There's so many ambiguity because he finds a comfort on this train.
Exactly.
And he seems to find a comfort, and I raise this as a question to you, in this very interesting, is it a suburban almost land? There's one image that keeps coming back to me because it seems, it was in the other poem too, Coming, about not only the far heads of houses, but another great line just after that. I'll find it later, but there's a great line here. What page is coming on? I'm going to find it now.
40, I'm not sure what it is in your edition, 47.
Here it is. In the deep garden, the thrush sings out his fresh peeled voice, astonishing the brickwork.
Isn't that wonderful?
And just the diction, I mean, is unparalleled. And but he seems to like this mixture, or he seems to thrive on this mixture of suburban and nature, more natural. And one line here, maybe not his best, but it's always caught my eye. Now fields where building plots and poplars cast long shadows over major roads.
Isn't that lovely?
I mean, the mixture of the rural...
Very well said.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So he's not pining away for a pure nature or a pastoral...
Yes.
And yet he's very judgmental of the encroachment of the landscape being destroyed by progress also.
Well, that's absolutely right, I think. And I think there's a very interesting... I mean, I don't want to make this too sort of super literary, but you're completely right about that, and it's something I've often thought myself. And the person it reminds me of, slightly surprisingly perhaps, since the context is so very different, is Wilfred Owen. Now, we know that Larkin liked Wilfred Owen very, very much. In fact, there's a brilliant essay on Owen that he wrote as a long review, which I might come back to in a minute, because it contains a very interesting thing that touches on other things that we're talking about. But we know that one of the ways in which Wilfred Owen's poems register their pity, the pity of war, in his famous phrase, is by introducing into barbaric contexts pastoral images which are associated with the opposite of that. I mean, you might say in Owen's poems that, you know, kind of brambles become barbed wire. I mean, that's the idea, isn't it? And I think a very similar thing happens in Larkin's poems, which is that his upbringing was essentially a suburban one. He was born in Coventry. He spent all his time living in towns. I mean, he's not a country boy. But he has, through books and through his own sort of appreciation of these things, a tremendously fond feeling for the countryside.
Doesn't it mirror his psychological state too, in a
Exactly.
certain way too?
Exactly. That's where it's all going,
yeah.
this, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. And these two sides, I mean, everything is at least two-minded, is really what we keep coming back to, isn't it? And the manifest world is, if you like, two-minded, and this is the representation of it. And exactly as mental states do in him, these two, the town and the country, I mean, to use the sort of shorthand word for it. I mean, of course, Hardy is in this very importantly as well.
Right.
One thinks, I'm thinking as I'm saying this, of the butterfly flying down the street in The Mayor of Casterbridge, having its sort of country manifestation and then being in the town and then going out into the countryside again at the other end. But as with the mental states, these two appear to conflict with each other, and in some respects do, but they, even more importantly, I think, sort of salt each other. I mean, they sort of excite each other, they animate each other, they put flavour in each other.
Right.
It's very interesting watching it happen.
Back to the point you were making earlier about is he being condescending or being socially critical of these working class or of the
Yeah.
more garish,
Yes.
or is he being envious, or is he being both? The ending of the poem fascinates me. I want to hear your thoughts on that arrow imagery, but also, what is this whole business at the end, a traveling coincidence, or the sense that what the heck is that about? That they're not aware of what the other, and yet is he the one that's aware? Is he the solitary one?
Yes.
He on the one hand doesn't have the experience, but he has the insight.
Quite.
Something.
I think that's more or less it.
Yeah.
It's complicated though, isn't it? Because if that is the sort of split, I mean, these people are doing it, but they're not really aware of it. He's not doing it, but he is aware of it. I mean, that's the sort of payoff for both of them.
He sees through it, in a way. He's superior to it in some way.
With a sort of vestigial envy / admiration, approval even, of it all. And which is, I guess, the point at the very end of the poem. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, I hope you felt this anyway, not to read the end of that poem without your heart sort of tightening inside you, because it's so beautiful and moving. And what's going on when you have that sensation is that you're thinking, actually, this is kind of wonderful. This is, love is wonderful, is what you're feeling there in some much more complicated than that way. And the poem, An Arundel Tomb, which is also somewhere in your hymn sheets, I think, has one of his most famous lines in it as its last line, which is heavily qualified by the line immediately before it. Our almost instinct, almost true. He's looking at an effigy in a cathedral, and this effigy shows a man and a woman, and they're holding hands, actually in the stone. Their stone hands are linked. And the moral of the poem, if you like, is that this image proves, and in the penultimate line he says, our almost instinct, almost true, which is, and this is the last line of the poem, what will survive of us is love. So this is not, I mean, Eeyore-ish he may be, but I mean, that's not the whole story. Eeyore doesn't say that, and Eeyore doesn't feel those things. And in that sense, it's very closely linked to what's happening at the end of the Whitsun Weddings, I think, which is that, yes, there is something sort of ridiculous, possibly self-deceiving, vulgar even, and to be looked down on about all this. But there is a lot else to be done about it as well, and felt about it as well.
What is the imagery of the arrows landing? I mean,
I think that what he's remembering there is, and I think I do say this in the biography, but it's sort of unprovable, of course. I think what he's remembering there, I don't know whether any of you remember this film, during the Second World War, partly for patriotic reasons, Laurence Olivier made a film of Henry V, Shakespeare's Henry V.
Oh, right, yeah.
And that has its beautiful shot of an arrow shower in it, doesn't it? I mean, beautiful but sort of menacing, actually. Because, of course, what do arrows do? Well, they kill people. I mean, they're going to kill a lot of French people, these arrows, in Henry V. But these are not, I think that is the kind of launch pad for this image in his imagination. I mean, how do we know? But I mean, that's my hunch. I know that he knew the film. But of course, these arrows turn to rain. What does rain do? Well, it doesn't kill people unless it's actually drowning them, but that's not the point here. I mean, what it's doing here is nourishing, isn't it? It's making things grow. It's making love grow. And I think that's the point. And derived at, I mean, just to connect at this level with something that you were saying quite rightly about Hardy and the Thrush in the earlier poem, these walls of blackened moss have always
It's a great image, isn't it?
It's wonderful. And it's incredibly Tennysonian, isn't it? I mean, it's Mariana, I think, in her Moated Grange, isn't it? I mean, and of all poems to be reminded of, what an interesting one at that point, because what is Mariana doing in that poem? I mean, she is somebody who is pining for a lover that, you know, is going to give her all sorts of problems when he eventually turns up. So it's not an inappropriate thing to be thinking about, I think, at that point. Anyway.
Why don't I read on this, I think, high windows. Is rather kind of a very strong poem, but it seems connected to the poem we just read in some way. You know, it's his whole position towards. When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, I know this is paradise. Everyone old has dreamed of all their lives. Bonds and gestures pushed to one side like an outdated combine harvester, and everyone young going down the long slide to happiness endlessly. I wonder if anyone looked at me 40 years back and thought, that'll be the life. No God anymore, or sweating in the dark about hell and that, or having to hide. Sorry, what you think of. What you think of the priest. He and his last will all go down the long slide like the bloody birds. And immediately, rather than words, comes the thought of high windows, the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it, the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. Okay, what's this one about?
Well, yes.
Okay.
Well, it's a much coarser-grained poem, isn't it? I think that this is the title poem of his last book, which came out in '74. I think I've got that date right. Overall, the poems in that book the grain isn't as fine as it is in the earlier work. This isn't to say that it's sort of no good. I think, for my money, the middle book probably is the great one. I mean, the really great one, the Whitsun Weddings book. But there are plenty of very fascinating poems in this last book. And as you say, I mean, what's going on, at least at the level of language here, is rather similar to what we were talking about in the overall shape of the Whitsun Weddings, which is to say that it gathers empirical material and speaks in a more or less demotic language for the first 4 verses. Emphatically so, in fact. Slightly uneasily, too, I think, actually. I mean, I've always thought that one of the ways in which this poem... I mean, it is troubling in all kinds of ways, this poem, but who takes pills in the plural? I mean, that's always struck me as being a little bit kind of awkward. I mean, you're on the pill, if we're talking about contraception here, which we are. If you take pills, you've got a headache. Yeah, it is a little bit, isn't it? In fact, more than a little bit, I think. Anyway, so there's that. And there's a lot to say about Larkin and difficulties with girls, to use the phrase that he and Kingsley Amis banded backwards and forwards. But anyway, just to finish the end of the point that I began by making, there is the same amazing sort of rhetorical lift-off here at the end. And I would say actually even more surprising in its intensity, in that what's actually on offer when you think about it here is not a thought at all. Rather than words comes the thought of high windows. Well, it is a thought, it's an image though, it's a sort of pure image, isn't it? So it takes us right back to the beginning of Larkin's writing life by reminding us very vividly of all this Yeatsian stuff that we began by talking about.
Why high windows? I mean, what in a literal, is he in a library? Is it a church? Is it a church? Why?
I think he probably is looking at the windows in the library as it happens.
Right.
I mean, what he's taking... Well, actually, quite a lot of the images here are complicated. Let's talk about this one to start with. Yeah. I would be very glad if somebody could explain what the combine harvester's doing there, too. I mean, it seems so sort of out of... I mean, I have some ideas about it, but it does... It's just...
Well, why don't we go through the poem tone by tone, okay? Do you want to do that?
Sure, yes.
When I say, if you look at the first stanza, is it a condescending or is it an envious? How would you characterize it? Everyone old has dreamed of all their lives. Is he excluded from this? Is he critical of it? Is he...
envious of it.
Envious of it, yes.
Among other things, I think. But I think his envy is sort of curdled into something that mixes condescension with actual anger, an anger which manifests his disappointment.
Poem. It's an angry...
It's pissed off, isn't it?
It's pissed off, yeah. Yet he's reducing...
He's a librarian, did you say?
He's reducing...
He's a library or
yes.
and they're
yes.
doing what he wants to be doing, sort of.
Yes, quite. But because he can't, or it's too late, because they're all young and he's too old and he's past it and he drinks too much and all this sort of idea of hanging around in the background of it all. There is a very tense relationship between envy and
it's a kind of
contempt.
It's sort of ungenerous to himself as well as to the scene that he's to the young people.
Yes, and you might say that that's what makes it sort of forgivable in this department, I think, that because it's ungenerous to himself too, he's sort of letting himself off the hook by saying, it's sort of how unpleasant to meet Mr. Elliot, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, how unpleasant to be Philip Larkin. Yeah. But not inappropriately, actually, because that seems to me rather a good connection to Elliot to make in the case of this poem. But if that were the whole story of it, it would be half the poem that it is, because as you...
Well, what does this mean? Bonds and gestures pushed... Everyone always dreamed of all their life.
I know this is paradise.
Bonds and gestures. Is that what he does? He makes bonds and gestures?
No.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Go ahead.
In the old world, I mean, it's dealing in sort of cartoon ideas of faithfulness and marriage structures and so on, relationship structures here.
Oh, the kids are pushing bonds and gestures.
In the old world, people, and this is something which fed his own reluctance to get married. He was engaged briefly as a young man, but that was the end of that. Thank you very much.
Right.
In the old world, people got married and they stayed married and they all got miserable and ended up having rows with each other. In the new world, people fuck each other all the time. Great, but it's too late for me. I mean, that's that poem that you quoted at the beginning. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, he says in the poem, or in another of his poems, which was rather late for me. Actually, biographically speaking, it turns out not to be true, that. But never mind. I mean, he's onto something, isn't there? That the world changed. I mean, the sense of, in the Western world, our sort of common morality changed around that time.
So, and everyone young going down the long slide to happiness endlessly, that too is ambivalent, right? I mean...
Well, I think so. Because there is a note in there, isn't there, of, but this can't really be true.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sort of cartooning it, as I said. But it's not only a cartoon. I mean, young people have the opportunity to live in a way that I didn't, and now it's too late.
Right.
That's kind of what's going on, isn't it?
He says he was an example of that back then, if anyone had looked at him the right way. So he's writing.
Yes,
he had all
exactly.
the potentiality of it.
Well...
He wondered
He's talking about free
Yes.
I thought he's talking comparing. I wonder if
Wait.
they did look
Yeah.
at it.
Let's raise our hands. Let's raise our hands. Okay.
No, he's bragging that he was potentially one of these. And it doesn't have anything to do with history. It wasn't his luck or his destiny, but he understands it very well, and in a way he's participating in it. Because he's writing
I'll
about
buy
it, he's
into
describing
that.
it.
I will.
And then the high windows is a sort of transcendence. It's ironic, it's not all that bitter. He's up there high looking through
Exactly.
it.
But
Something that's equally endless, that's all.
Exactly.
But the high windows is sort of a rationalization for his own state a little bit, isn't it? Or it's sort of a...
He doesn't have to rationalize.
No, he doesn't have to. In
He's just
fact,
there. He hasn't done it, but he came to the edge of doing
In
it.
fact, he doesn't want to rationalise it anymore. It's rather the point, isn't it? That's the point of shifting it off into the world of pure image. I mean, where thought... I mean, he calls it a thought, but it isn't really. I mean, it is an image. But certainly not verbal. Rather than words comes the thought of eye windows.
Everything is not words either. He's
Sure.
found his own way of not wording.
Yes, exactly.
things.
Where things don't have to be resolved one way or the
That's
other.
right. It's
That's
a
the
sort
point.
of
Yeah.
a magnificent indifference.
Exactly.
for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Okay, one more question, then we have to leave. We'll have questions at the end, but Andrew's going to read.
Thanks.
Yes.
Just quickly,
Yeah.
I thought it was a comparison of two different shifts, and that he was a part of the shift away about the death of God shift. And the people must have looked at him and thought, oh, now you're a young man and you're free because nobody believes in
Yeah.
God anymore. You don't have to worry about
Yeah,
priests.
yeah.
Sure.
As opposed to him at his age, he's looking at the kids and thinking, oh, now you're free, you get sex. So I thought he was comparing two different moments in history and saying it's sort of all the same and nobody's really free. And
Yes, he is, but there's another turn on top. I think this
Okay,
is
speed
important.
list, yeah.
So I think this is important. Like, his lot will all
But
go
it shows
down.
also, it does show that there's almost a deliberate ambiguity, and then there are answers to it too, and then where everyone's looking for them. But yes, go ahead. So,
No, I
yeah.
agree with that, what you said totally.
Yeah.
But then, and his lot will all go down the long slide like free bloody birds. Okay.
The long
Think
slide makes
about-
the whole poem
think
for me.
about
You get the- yeah.
Then he thinks about the windows, and beyond it, the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. That's fear. It sounds like tremendous ambivalence there about the free bloody birds going out into nowhere.
Well,
Who's a
I have to say, I do
librarian?
think you're onto something here.
There's an ambivalence there.
I think it's very... I think it's a lot of apparently rather contradictory things at one and the same time, which is really what we're all saying
Right.
about this. I think there is a fearfulness there, because I think it, looked at from one angle, you might say it's death. I mean, what else goes on
I
forever?
think so.
Without any
You know,
boundaries,
exactly.
you have no existence.
But at the same time, it's very beautiful.
Yeah.
It's also, of course, highly significantly a place where there is no other person. I mean, the rest of the poem is about people and how you do or don't communicate with them. So it is a vision of absolute, utter solitude, but not entirely a bad thing, we feel, in the way the rhetoric makes us respond to it. So...
In general, would you say, I mean, I think I asked you before and you agreed, but I think it should be repeated as we conclude. There's anxiety when any situation involves anyone else that comes up in his poems.
Yes.
And he's uneasy with this level of, there's a peacefulness or a lack of anxiety, but it's always alone. It seems that any other is a disturbance for him. It's amazing.
The abiding question in the poems is how to connect with other people. Do you want to? What happens when you do? Will it be forever? Are you burdened with obligations that make it sort of impossible?
He almost doesn't know what to do about excitement. He observes it in others. You know, those young people getting married, and for all of their superficialness or for all of their blindness or narrowness possibly, they're letting it, they're on the long, they're down the long, and he's always aloof and can't seem to really release passion.
Yeah. But they feel so passionate, don't they?
Yeah.
He's always standing on the outside somehow.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
almost a solipsistic universe.
Yes.
When he struggles with these questions, shall I or shall, what is it like over there?
Indeed.
What are you really? And he's outside.
Well, in one of his
Inside
prose
that
pieces,
place.
he hilariously I think, hilariously, because he makes no fuss about it. It looks as, I mean, you almost don't notice it because he doesn't sort of draw attention to what he's doing, but he rewrites that very famous John Donne remark. So he says, every man is an island. I mean, that's...
Really? Yeah. Yeah. One more question and then...
I'd just like to suggest something about the difference in the language here, in the movement. It's very coarse.
Yes.
Very bitter.
Right.
Sometimes the beginning, the first stanza reminds me of a ballad by Auden called When I Walked Out.
Just a little bit like that. Yes.
And it goes on so that by the end, I mean, I think there's a lot of bitterness and a lot of self-mockery in this. And by the end, he's in another place.
Yeah.
He's looking out behind. I thought immediately of church or a cathedral. But he's looking out and he's in a spiritual place, which is very different. And whatever he might be separated from the beginning and bitter about, I think there's a resolution.
Well, he's attempting a resolution, but I don't know how convinced he is that he's
The previous poem that we talked about, Woodson Weddings, is filled with oxymorons.
Absolutely.
And violent images, blood, gouts of steam, and so on.
That's right.
So there's an intensity here that I think is
Yes, well said. Very good. Very good. It's very interesting. I mean, it's fascinating seeing how sort of animating he is of us all. I've often thought, reading his poems, because there's quite a large proportion of sort of exegesis in them, because they talk at us. They appear a lot of the time to undertake precisely the activity that a literary critic would expect to be doing. In fact, quite often when I have been writing about his poems in a sort of non-biographical way, but in a literary critical way, I felt that he's sort of stolen a march on me all the time. But isn't it interesting how fraught with paradox and ambiguity they fundamentally are? Which is one of the reasons why they'll be here forever, I think. In fact, to be honest, I find it very difficult to think of a poet who writes like this, I mean, in this kind of way, and using these sorts of bits of the tradition, who does it better. Yeah. And like you, I mean, I've had these poems off by heart all my life now, and I just go on being more and more interested in them, and feel I sort of barely know them. Yeah. In a good way.
But there's always a sadness. There's always a...
yeah. Well, he speaks in one of his essays about Stevie Smith. I don't know whether people read Stevie Smith over here, do they?
Is that the...
A little bit, yeah. He speaks of... He liked Stevie Smith's poems. And he uses a very interesting phrase about it. He says that, people might think she's sort of dotty or silly or throwaway, but she has the authority of sadness. And so does he.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, not everybody in the world would like a poet who has the authority of sadness, but I do, and he clearly did, which is why he liked Christina Rossetti, who also has the authority of sadness, or Owen, or Hardy.
Or Hardy.
Yeah, quite.
Reminds me of Raymond Carver, where I'm not talking about Provenance.
Yes.
Because he sort of made dispossession, so he treated
well, that's fair enough.
Lyricism.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And they're both very economical writers. Well, until the new version of Carver's.
Okay, we'll hopefully have time for questions at the end. Andrew's going to read some from his from In the Blood, and make sure to leave time for it. If you want to read at least the Fox Fox poem that concludes your recent book of poems, or whatever 2 or 3 short poems that you wrote.
I didn't quite make up my mind which bit of this book I was going to read before I came here, because I wanted to sort of see you. But I think that's what I'm going to do. This is a book that I published in England about 18 months ago, and takes the story... Michael, I'm sorry, you've heard me say this before. But I need to say it again to people who haven't heard me read from it before. That takes my sense of life up to the age of my, I mean, it tells my life story. I try to, it's too embarrassing to say that, up until the age of 17. And it's written from the point of view of somebody who is about that age. So there's no retrospection in this book. There's no interrogation of a younger self by an older self. There's no if I knew then what I know now. Stuff just happens in it. And the reason that I did it like that was partly because I can remember my early childhood very clearly, and partly because I wanted it to be a sort of manifestation of childhood, the book, as well as something which was about it. The gain, I hoped, would be sort of freshness, immediacy, the wonderment that children feel. The loss might be in the lack of interrogation, but I made that calculation. I reckon that the gains would be greater than the losses, rightly or wrongly. So if it sounds a bit naive, it's meant to. Or something like, not quite naive, but something like that anyway. And I thought I'm now thinking I'm going to read you a bit which is really about my father, who was still alive when the book was written and died almost immediately after I finished writing it. In fact, it was a curious part of his signing off, I think, to have read it. Anyway, I'm about 10 here, and my brother Kit and I and my mother and my father have gone on holiday to Ireland, where my father is teaching me to fish, speaking of Raymond Carver, as you were. One of the great writers about fishing, I think. I'm a very keen fisherman, thanks to my dad. But I got off to a bit of a dodgy start, as you'll see.
Is that a poet laureate trait? Wasn't Ted Hughes a big salmon?
Ted was a fantastically good fisherman. Yeah. No, you have to be.
Well, I am too. So
good.
I think I'm next in line.
You're the next. Good. Oh, I didn't know that. Good.
Oh yeah. Well, we'll talk about that.
Good. I'll just read. This is what 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. But I'll read it quickly.
No, do not rush. We had a half an hour.
Okay. Next morning, I went down to the jetty again with Kit before breakfast. Look, I said, pointing to the milky horizon and suddenly wanting to tease him. You can see the cliffs of America from here. Really, where? Said Kit, shielding his eyes. There, I said, there. Oh, yes, Kit said quietly. Then after a pause, what are those people doing? Are they waving? He was talking so seriously I couldn't resist shading my own eyes for a moment, and that's when he exploded, shoving me towards the water. By the time I got my balance again, he was halfway back to the hotel. He was going shopping with Mum in Roundstone to buy a white fisherman's jersey, like the kind Val Dunican wore sometimes, who was a sort of cheesy balladeer, with patterns in the knitting. It was his treat because I was spending the day with Dad, and I couldn't decide whether I felt jealous or not. But when Dad and I finally set off with our rods and sandwiches from the woman in the kitchen, I was too nervous to think about it anymore. Were we going to walk all the way to the mountain top? Apparently, that's what Mum had meant when she said I'd have to keep up. The path looked very long and was littered with sharp stones, and it made my teeth hurt. After a while, we turned off by a stream and high-stepped through the heather until we came to a pond. So far, so good, I thought, but I made a mistake when I said the pond looked pretty. Not a pond, old boy, a loch, said Dad, making a phlegmy noise for the GH. I stared at the water again. A giant puddle, brown, still as a mirror, with bristly weeds along the far edge and a purple mountain rising behind. We put our sandwiches on a rock, then Dad opened his box of flies. This turned out to be even better than the sweet tin in Mum's desk. I'd never seen such pretty reds and blues. He told me some of their names, which were like spells, and tied a yellow one on the end of my line. We'll start with yours, he said, and when you've got the hang of it, I'll fix up my own. It was the first time he'd talked to me like this, being a teacher, only nicer, and it made me want to look at him more closely. His hands, for instance. At home, they were always nervous, flicking ash off a cigarette, twiddling his signet ring, trembling when he cut the heads off roses, clenching and unclenching on the arm of his red chair in the drawing room. Now they didn't shake, and were long and thin and nifty, even the funny one, which he'd squashed in the deck chair. They felt strong, too, when he came to stand behind me, gripped me round both wrists, and showed me how to flick the rod up to my shoulder, then wait for a moment while the line whistled out behind, then how to fling it forward again, so the line curled past us like a giant's signature, and lay down on the water. "The quieter it goes, the better," he whispered, "and the further the better, too. They're clever things, fish, much cleverer than us, and try to have got radar for ears, so we have to be quiet, too." I immediately lost my balance and flipped over a weedy stone with my gumboot. It made a splash like a nuclear bomb, but Dad didn't say anything. He just squeezed me tighter, and we made another cast. Dad let me try by myself and turned away to fix his own rod. It had felt so easy when he was controlling my hands. I thought I must be a natural and had in my blood all the things I needed to know, just waiting to appear. But as it turned out, I had a lot of other things in my blood as well, things that were a real nuisance and made me catch the grass and tangle my line and bang up the reel and hook my coat. Dad tried not to notice at first, but he couldn't pretend for long. "Don't worry," he said, "it's always like this to start with." He put down his rod to watch, telling me to flick further back, or not so far, or exactly like that, dead right. I made a few good casts, then caught the heather behind me again. This time he shook his head. He wanted to get started himself. So after a few more tries and a near miss when I found the fly hurtling towards my eyeball like a hornet and thought I'd be blind forever, I tidied up my reel as best I could, then sat on the rock beside the sandwiches. Dad was the expert. If I paid close attention, I'd learn eventually. He looked completely alone. That was the most surprising thing. The heathery wall of the mountain behind him kept blurring in cloud. Gusts of wind thumped the surface of the loch into mucky little waves. Sunlight smashed the clouds, then vanished. But none of this made any difference. The moment Dad stepped away from the shore, he forgot everything except what he was doing. His brain slithered out of his head and ran down his arms, along his rod, into the line, then sliced backwards and forwards through the air before disappearing underwater. That's why his face suddenly looked softer, why dark creases had appeared in his cheeks, why the bone of his jaw had come loose. He wasn't in himself anymore. It was like seeing a dead person who was still alive. So I tried to concentrate on other things, just as how cold it was getting and how good the sandwiches looked. Surely Dad couldn't have forgotten about them too. He'd warned me about this. "The great thing about fishing," he said on the way up the stony path, "is not minding if you don't catch anything." "You mean nothing at all?" I said. "That's right. If I counted the hours I'd spent flogging rivers here and there and never had a nibble, people would think I'd wasted half my life. But it's not about catching things, it's about fishing. That's what counts." I glanced across to the mountain, then back at the loch again, and didn't believe him. There he was, frowning like a demon, crouching forward as he tried to land his fly alongside the reeds on the far bank. He definitely wanted to catch something, and so did I. I wanted to feel a trout wriggling in my hands, then knock it on the head with the special stick in Dad's bag, which was called a priest, then carry it back to show Mum and Kit, then give it to the woman in the kitchen so she could cook it for supper. But I had to get used to the idea that this wasn't going to happen today, and may not happen tomorrow either. It made me feel colder, and I checked my watch. Kit would be back in our room by now, unpacking his new jersey. Suddenly, Dad gave a little whoop, and his rod bent like in one of the engravings along the back landing at home. I leapt to my feet and tiptoed towards him. "Where is he?" I wanted to say, but that would be daft. The fish was right there, where the line stretched underwater, a brown wobble, like a penny sinking into a wishing well. "He's not going to fall off, is he?" I asked, hoping that sounded sensible. "Better not," said Dad. He was reeling in faster now, and I could see a stubby nose jutting above the surface. "He looks okay," Dad said, "but just to be sure, why don't you go to the bank and grab him when I get him into that shallow bit?" I could see that was a good idea, and set off towards a little inlet. Dad could dangle the fish into that, then I would pounce. "You can get him now," Dad said, and because that sounded easy too, I leant down and snatched. But the trout was bigger than I'd thought. The water had disguised him. The slime on his body was thick, too, like an invisible layer of clothing, and impossible to grip. No wonder my friend Peter Routledge had said tickling them was difficult. You might as well try to catch soap. My fingers closed round the middle, then squirted off to the tail immediately, where there was even less to grip, though it looked drier. It didn't matter. The hook was still stuck tight. All Dad had to do was keep reeling in, swinging his rod towards me, and in a moment the fish would be through the shallows and onto the bank, where I could whack it with the priest. I tried to hurry up, dipping my hands into the water and shushing forward. That was a mistake. My hands hit the line and knocked the hook clear. There was the fly, droopy yellow, lying on a finger of weed, and there was the fish, almost beached on the stones. We were going to lose him. That was obvious. We were going to lose him, and it was my fault. Dad hadn't seen exactly what had happened. He was too far away, but I didn't have any excuse. The gills were already moving faster, getting ready to dive. The 2 seconds I'd been hunched over, staring, were probably like 2 years in fish time. That's why the trout was feeling so much better and about to make a dash for it. It's why I had to make a dash too, otherwise we'd talk about it for the rest of the holidays. Mum would decide I wasn't ready for Scotland, and Dad would never take me with him again. I dropped on the fish as if I was smothering a rugger ball, then clambered upright and scooped him onto the bank with a mighty flick. "What happened?" Dad asked, hobbling towards me over the slippy stones. "Sorry about that," I said in my grown-up voice. "Lost my footing. I got the fish, though. There he is." We bent down and inspected him, a glittery little stick with grass bits on him like stripes of green blood. "Shall we knock him on the head?" I wondered. "I don't think so," Dad said softly. "He's going of his own accord." Then he put his hand on my arm. "Not much of a fish, is he? Just a little fellow." He picked him up easily, with no sliding, and popped him in his bag. "You're first," he said. "Not mine, Dad," I told him. "Yours." He pretended he hadn't heard, and set off along the stream towards the stony path, our 2 rods bouncing on his shoulder. So... well, that's very nice of you. Thank you. Michael very sweetly asked me to read this particular poem, so I will.
Oh, and there's one other too. I hope I brought it out here. Oh, I don't know if it's in there. You remember we discussed the other day about the tablecloth that reminded you?
I'll read that.
Okay,
Yeah,
you have
I'll
that
read
too?
that.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe.
I'll read that one first, actually.
Yeah,
This is a sort of cheerful
You remember?
poem that Michael was talking about the other day. Called On the Table. About buying a tablecloth. Kinda. I don't want you to think I buy tablecloths all the time. I don't. I wrote this poem a very long time ago, I should say. In another life. I would like to make it clear that I have bought this tablecloth with its simple repeating pattern of dark purple blooms not named by any botanist, because it reminds me of that printed dress you had the summer we met, a dress you have always said I never told you I liked. Well, I did, you know. I did. I liked it a lot, whether you were inside it or not. How did it slip so quietly out of our life? I really hate to think of some other bum swinging those heavy flower heads left to right. I hate even more to think of it mouldering on a tip or torn to shreds, a piece here wiping a dipstick, a piece there tied round a crack in a lead pipe. It's all a long time ago now, darling, a long time. But tonight, just like our first night, here I am, with my head light in my hands and my glass full, staring at the big, drowsy petals until they start to swim, loving them, but wishing to lift them aside, unbutton them, tear them even, if that's what it takes to get through to the beautiful, moon-white, warm, wanting skin of you. My poems have recently been translated into Japanese, rather astoundingly, and I had a very hilarious letter from my Japanese translator saying, rightly enough actually, when you say wanting, do you mean wanting, desiring, or lacking? So I said both, of course. It's the kind of default answer for writers, isn't it? Anyway, I'll just read this other poem, which I also wrote a little while ago. I mean, this book came out in '92, I think. It is the most recent book that I've published. My new book's coming out next year. And it has a title which is a slightly odd one. In that very mysterious book, the Book of Job, it says, "The fox provides for himself, but the lion speaks only to God." I suppose it means, among other things, that the sort of wonderful bloody-minded, independent-mindedness of foxes is what characterises them, but the lordly lion, etc. It's written at a time when I was living in a house which had a family of foxes living at the bottom of the garden. Actually, I now live in another house which also has a family of foxes living in the bottom of the garden, which is to say that foxes are pretty much taking over London. So foxes stank and littered in St Paul's. I mean, it's not the first time there have been foxes in London.
Foxes are making a comeback.
They sure
in the
are.
suburbs too.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. So the fox provides for himself. It could have been an afternoon at the end of our lives. The children gone, the house quiet, and time our own. Without a window, without a word, we stalled at a window looking down. Weak winter sunlight sank through the beech tree next door, skimming the top of our dividing wall, spilling a primrose stain surprisingly far into our own patch. Earlier that same year, we had laid new grass, and the squares of earth underneath it all still showed like the pavement of an abandoned town, though the grass itself had done well, and from that angle looked white as the breeze admired it, while we simply went on standing there, holding hands now, trying to drown the faint dynamo hum of London and lift off into nowhere. Maybe we did drift a little. At any rate, something changed. A shadow worked itself loose at the edge of our world. Not a shadow, a fox. We saw it droop over the neighbouring wall and step, using the sun as a plank of solid wood, down through the air until, landing on all fours, it rolled sideways. This was no stumble, and stretched out, owning the place. Big for a fox, I thought, but said nothing, holding my breath, the sun burning so far into his coat, each bristle stood distinct, ginger everywhere, but in fact red rising through brown to black to grey at the tip, like bare plant stalks dying towards the light, but of course soft, so I knew my hand would come away warm if I touched, and smelling of garlic. First he lay there, checking the silent earth with one ear, but soon the music started and he was up, a puppet living a secret life, stiff-spined but getting the hang of it, imitating all that he'd seen real foxes do and not been able, examining leaves, staring out flowers, then deciding to stop that. There was no danger here, only pleasure. And to prove it, he must fold his dainty front paws, stick his ramrod brush in the air, angle his plough-shaped mast to the grass, keep his back legs normal, and shunt himself slowly forward, inch by inch, left cheek, then right, then left, then right again, smearing his mouth so far open I saw the pegs of his teeth, the pink inside the gums flecked with black, before he tired of that too, and found under our laurel bush the children's football, a sorry pink and blue punctured thing, which must be killed now, and in one particular way, by flicking it sharply into the air, and as it fell, butting it almost too far to reach, but hoiking it back on invisible string, bringing death down in a frenzy of grins and delirious yaps. After that, silence again. When I returned to myself, the fox was upright, his coat convulsed in an all-over shrug, as if it were new and not fitting, like a dog when it jumps out of water and stands legs braced in a halo of dew, before trotting off in a hurry once more, which soon he did, back to the neighbour's wall, and as he leapt, he seemed to hang on the bricks, slackened, to show his skeleton must have somehow slipped from his body, or so I thought, watching the breeze reopen his fur and waiting to see how he dropped. Hardly a fox now, more like a trickle of rust, my hand still holding your hand as he went, then letting go. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
A few comments, actually, about a few comments about Larkin.
Sure.
It seems to me in Tall Windows that the image of paradise and happiness confront the reader in a way that makes the reader, or us, really, ask ourselves what happiness in paradise consists of, and that I think that what he's believing in is that that exists to the extent that the person themselves believe in it. And that's why each time we hear it or experience it, it becomes fresh. And specifically in Wits and Weddings, with the image of the arrow, I think that what he's doing, at least for me, is casting the arrow outward, almost like a boomerang, and that it curves back around and then aims directly at the reader. And then, because it is poetry, it's coming back at us in a way that's not going to kill us like an arrow will, it comes back as rain, and somehow it's fostering growth within us.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I mean, I think you can say that without bringing in the boomerang, which is a rather confusing image to have, because boomerang does something so different, doesn't it, from what an arrow does. I mean, what you can say is that the poem does sort of turn itself towards us at the end there, in the way that you very well describe. I think that is absolutely right, and lets us in. I mean, the parameters and the means of and the positions of observation change very interestingly at the end of the poem. That's right.
Me? Yes, sir.
I thought that to go a little further about the arrows.
Yes.
It seemed to me that since this is a poem about newly married people, these arrows also are sperm.
Yes.
Which are often the symbol for that is often an arrow.
It is.
And that so that it ends really with an image of the sperm shooting out, landing on her, fertilizing. So it's an image really also that reflects his sense of his own distance from the possibility of being fertile and having the kind of sort of ordinary pleasures of
That's a really important point. Where the poem ends, yes, he's definitely thinking of what these couples are going home to do, and what he's not going.
No question.
Yeah,
Absolutely right. No, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah,
I mean, they are arrows of desire, quite specifically.
Cupid's arrows, or is that?
Sorry, I missed that.
Cupid's arrows. I think
Yes. That's all there too.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I'm slightly sorry that I said that about the Henry V business before we sort of established this, because I'm sure that is primarily what's in his mind. I mean, it may be that the sort of deep visual source for the poem has got something to do with the film. I saw it again it was on British television recently. Must be about to go to war again. It does bring the poem incredibly vividly to mind. I mean, it does sort of fit in a comfortable way, but that association is much further down and below these things that you're talking about now, I think. Yeah.
Daphne?
I just wanted to ask you two things, sort of more biographically,
Yes.
about Larkin's life. One is the relationship with women.
Yeah.
To me, he always seemed like about the allure for the women of the misogynist.
Yes.
And when you talked about compartmentalization, wasn't that one of them wrote a memoir, Maeve Brennan?
She did.
Right.
She did.
Did you find, since he was always presented as sort of a tamped down, romantically nihilistic figure, were you surprised? I mean, I certainly was when I read your biography. Were you surprised by the sort of rather hectic involvement with women?
Yes. I sort of knew a little bit about it because of the conversations that we'd had. I knew May very well, and I knew Monica even better, and got on much better with Monica. I mean, this may not mean very much to those of you who don't know the story, but essentially what happened was that as he left university, as he left Oxford and went off to teach to work in the library in this little place called Wellington in Shropshire, sort of Wilfred Owen country actually. He fell in love with, and got engaged to a woman called Ruth. There was a very slow and complicated disentanglement from that. She was very young when they met. She's still alive.
She is?
Yeah.
Married, I hope?
Yeah. Yes. Right. Absolutely. Good thing to say. I agree. with your implication there, because he made her very unhappy. And no, she did. She did get married and has a grown-up child. And then he moved from there to Leicester, which is where he met Monica Jones. And they fell in love with each other eventually. I mean, he took a long time sort of aligning himself with Monica. And then he went to work in the library at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And there was some other women over there. And then he came to Hull. Monica sort of trotting around after him through these places, but still based in Leicester, but going to see him a lot in Ireland. And then seeing him more easily, of course, when he came back to the mainland and was up in Hull. And the big romance of his life, the other romance of his life when he was in Hull, was with Maeve Brennan, who was a woman who worked in the library, who was a strict Catholic, and wouldn't go to bed with him. And then when she did, guess what happened? It sort of ended. And years later, after they'd had a very sort of tender, affectionate, but not actually going to bed, not actual sex relationship. I'll say a little bit more about her in a minute, if I may. And he also had an important relationship with his secretary, the low-fared secretary. So the big overlap really is between Maeve, Monica, and Betty, the secretary. And a lot of people were made very, very unhappy through this, including Monica, who was better able to deal with it, more resilient in herself than the others were. More free-thinking, I partly mean, but also sort of emotionally stronger than the others were, though herself very, very upset. And when, as I hope will quite soon happen, Philip's correspondence with Monica is published, I mean both sides of it is published, we're in for a real treat. These are wonderful, wonderful letters. I mean, really, really good. His letters anyway are completely fascinating, I think, but that correspondence in particular, which lacks, to its benefit, the sort of biliousness that's there in the correspondence with Amos, for instance. It's a sort of masterpiece, I think. And her letters are terrifically good, too. She never published anything. She worked all her life in the English department at the University of Leicester, never publishing anything. And this is kind of her book, as it turns out. So there's going to be a very interesting outcome to that story. Maeve, when I was writing the book, this is part of your question or not, I don't know, but when I was writing the book, I went to talk to all these women, of course. And they were, by and large, very, very helpful. Monica,
you were saying before, many of them didn't know of
yeah, well,
so he was more active than you might. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we're still not talking. I mean, I'm not talking about Casanova here exactly. Yeah. It's just more than anybody thought. I mean, because like you, I think a lot of people thought, oh well, if sexual intercourse really did begin in 1963, there are going to be no girls in this book then. And surprise, surprise, there are 6 or 7 autoletters. So anyway, I went to see Maeve. She's the strict Catholic one, and I explained that I was seeing everybody, and she said, well, I can't talk to you about the sort of intimate stuff at all, and I won't. And yes, I've got lots of letters from him, but you can only see these ones that she hadn't actually cut them up, but she sort of typed out selections from them to give me, so it was very sort of retained and protected. And I said, fine, I completely understand. And I did feel fine about it. I mean, it's her life, for God's sake. She's dead now, of course, as you know, probably, but so I went when I wrote my book, and I gave it to all the kind of key players in it to read before it came out, just so that I hadn't said anything either which was wrong or which they didn't want to live with, because obviously a lot of people were going to read it. By and large, as you would expect in Larkin's life, Larkin being Larkin, these are people who knew nothing about the public world. I mean, they'd never met a journalist before, and they didn't know how evil journalists are and how inquisitive they were going to be and all this kind of thing. Anyway, so I gave it to everybody to read, including Maeve, and I thought that she would ask me to cut out quite a lot of the stuff that I had surmised. I mean, I tried to write it sensitively, but au contraire, she said, oh, well, now that everybody else has talked, I see that I sort of must. And she said that I'd written this document, which was sort of model of the memoir thing that she eventually published, let me see all the letters. I mean, she was incredibly helpful by the end of it. And actually, her life changed very much for the better, I have to say, because of all this. She enjoyed being the person who'd been important to Larkin. She was completely up for talking about all this stuff. Her father, her long-lived, rather tyrannical father, died at more or less the same time as Philip did. And she just became a freer woman at the end of her life. It was rather wonderful to see, actually. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'd helped her, but sort of inadvertently, it was a help for her, all this stuff. She enjoyed life more.
Can I just ask about the third, about
Betty.
Betty.
She's still alive. Betty was rather kind of gung-ho about the whole thing. She didn't want to talk very much, but it sort of wasn't very much of a big deal for her. She plays golf, Betty, and she's no nonsense. She's a kind of good northern woman, she sort of strides around and sorts things out. You want to go to bed with me? Fine. It's kind of like that. Hilariously, Philip said to her, and actually rather revealingly, but characteristically in a sort of comic Larkin way, bleakly, blackly comic way, he said to her, I would have asked you before, except I thought I was sounding a bit like T.S. Eliot. He married his secretary, because, of course, marriage was the great terrifying thing that might be sprung on him in all these relationships. But Betty didn't expect that, so that was all fine.
In the back there, you've had your hand up a lot. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I see as much Edward Thomas in Philip Larkin's poetry as Thomas.
Very good. Very good.
I'd just like to hear, what you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for saying that. I think that it was probably one of the reasons why we bonded, because he knew that I'd been writing about Thomas, and he is absolutely there. And I think the only thing that I would say to sort of control a bit this sense of overlap and connectedness between the two is this, that when you're reading a Thomas poem, characteristically, as I'm sure you agree, you feel that you're reading a poem which is somehow proving to you that it's a thought which hasn't yet been finished. That's the way that he balances the unit that a line is, or plays against one another, the unit that a line is with the unit that a verse is, with the unit that a whole poem is, and the way that he sort of peers around his line endings as though he's not quite sure what's coming, and probably isn't quite sure what's coming, and allows us to do that as readers ourselves, introduces a sort of hesitancy, a sort of beautiful, sensitized tentativeness into his poems, which isn't quite the mood of a Larkin poem, which, as we were saying earlier, are full of qualifications, if onlys, no buts, on the other hand, all this kind of thing, and masses of negatives and uns and disses and in the diction of the things. Nevertheless, he, as we were saying, he is sort of confidently without confidence in a way that you can't quite say of Edward Thomas.
You began the evening by talking about this continuity with Hardy, Thomas, Larkin. What is the phrase? Is there a phrase, the English line?
Well,
but if that's pertinent or not, what does unify them in your own?
Word on.
The word "un," yes, the word "un," quite. Well, I feel a bit suspicious of these things, but of course literary critics like them, don't they? Because it's a way of kind of mapping the country. And I suppose you can say that probably there are some precursors to this, but there is a line coming down from Wordsworth that uses certain tones of voice, particularly, of course, uses landscape in a certain way, and manifests a sensibility. I'm avoiding using all the words that would nail this down. That goes. You see it in Tennyson, you see it in Hardy, you see it in Edward Thomas, you certainly see it in Larkin. Certain expectations about form, certain expectations about tone of voice, certain expectations about landscape. And occasionally, though this is not for me to say, people have said the same things about my own poems, and I don't have any hesitation to saying, yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, these are the poets that I like, and insofar as any writer sees themselves in a tradition.
And you were talking about how these writers were very, very conscious
I think so.
of what you're talking about, or working with that. Okay,
I think so, and of course, increasingly. I don't suppose Wordsworth himself probably was, but he probably would have couched it rather differently and related it to folk poetry. ballads and simple stuff, which you do see in the background of all these people, and who are among my own. I mean, Anon. He's one of my favourite poets too. I must say,
a big influence.
Yes, big influence. But I hope that answers your question about Thomas. He did love Thomas. I remember him, Philip, saying that he wanted to give him a bit of a kicking sometimes too, and he sort of got a bit fed up with him, a bit impatient with him. And given what I've just said about the difference in this approach to what it is to be hesitancy.
Thomas is very demanding in a way. You really, he's so quiet or so subtle in a way that he asks.
Yes. Quite. I think so. I mean, I adore
Larkin
his poems.
He's great. I mean, and largely unknown here still.
Alas, yes. So come on, guys.
Well, we need a biography.
We need a biography. Yes.
Okay, one or two. Okay, go.
Is High Windows Larkin's Sailors Byzantium?
Oh, well, that's an interesting thought, in the sense that it's a yes, I guess, yes. Yes, that's right. It's true that, yes. I think you're probably onto something there. I mean, I wondered whether you meant at that level or whether you meant in a sort of summarising way, which of course would also be true. I mean, whether Yeats did, I'm sure, write that poem with a sense that he was pulling a lot of stuff together and making it a sort of near the centre of the target Yeats poem, so to speak. Whether Larkin wrote High Windows in the same spirit, I slightly doubt, but it does have some of those sort of gathering qualities.
This is no country for all the young in one another's arms. I think
and the free bloody birds.
Yeah.
Right, in the trees.
Yeah. Well, people keep I
think Larkin's reputation is not as high in this country as it should be. And I think partially in creative writing because he writes rhyming and metrical poems.
That's right.
But also, I think you're responsible. Your biography, it was ill-timed in a way because the political correctness was cresting when it came out.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you'd ever regretted those revelations that were in your...
Oh, no. God, no. Not at all. In fact, absolutely opposite to that. If there'd been any delay, I mean, two things to say quickly about that. One is that by the time that my biography had come out, the letters had already come out. And that's what really tipped people off on the sort of political correctness conversation that you're alluding to there. There was a real rumpus about them. Rightly. I mean, there are things... I beg your pardon? Tom Paulin, yes.
One taken off the...
It was reported as that. Actually, Tom never, who's a good friend of mine, and never did say that. But people got very sort of hot under the collar about it all. And as I say, rightly, in all sorts of respects. I mean, there is something to talk about here. It's a conversation which gets boring quite quickly, but I mean, it certainly needs to be said. So that's the first thing I want to say. The other thing is to say quickly is that if I delayed writing this book, we would all have got it in the neck for kind of covering it up or holding it back or something. Get it out there. Let's be grown up about this. Have the conversation. I have to say, I think it's got much, much more to do with other things, modernism in particular, than it's got to do with political correctness, the relative sizes of Larkin's reputation here as compared to England, where there was this bad rumpus. Has it been bad for his reputation? No, it's been nothing but good for his reputation. People now read his poems in a much more searching, adult way than they did during his own lifetime. I mean, something rather bad happened to the reading of Larkin's poems, which in a sense helps to explain the explosion that happened when the letters and the biography came out, which is that he became a national treasure, and we know what happens when people become national treasures. They're read very, very softly. I mean, did people really think that Larkin found women easy, enjoyed foreign travel, and voted Labour? I mean, you think that they... I mean, what had they been reading all this time? I mean, really, I mean, so I feel nothing, but I feel rather proud of myself for getting it out there, actually, to be honest with you about this. Let's be grown-ups, let's have the conversation.
What?
I just want to say one thing about the memoir. Thanks so much for reading your own memoir.
Oh, not at all.
It was really kind of, it was just one of the great Oedipal, funny Laurentian. You know, I was laughing, and it was Laurentian, and it was wonderful. I really appreciate reading that. And also the poem you read.
The two poems were tremendous.
Fantastic.
Really.
Tablecloth.
Well,
it was great.
Well, sweet of you to say.
I really appreciate that.
Well, it's very nice of you to say. I mean, there is one thing I'll quickly say, and then we can stop about that, which is that it is written from the child's point of view. But of course, I wasn't a child when I was writing it. So, off stage, all the allusion you make to Lawrence and Oedipal myths there, I wanted to manifest it, but I just didn't want to flag it up and interrogate it.
It's singular.
It's there. That is there for you to do. I mean, you the reader to do. Is what I felt. Anyway, enough. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. He can't come. They can't. I do it within. This is available outside. He will sign copies of the book for you.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tatey's events is available at philiptatey.org.